Good evening, everyone. My name is Professor Hugh Brady. I'm the President of Imperial College London, a post that I've held since August the 1st of this year, so I'm still very much an outsider. It's been wonderful to me to take the reins of such a fantastic institution. I'm a clinician scientist by training, as you might be able to tell from my accent, originate from Dublin, but a migrant worker, an academic journey that took me from Dublin to Toronto, Boston, Bristol, and now Imperial. I entered academic medicine on the basis of a medical student elective at the Hammersmith Hospital, now one of our most important partners, in 1981. So it's been wonderful for me to bookend my career in an institution that, as you hopefully you know, is so committed to not just world-class education and research, but also to innovation, entrepreneurship, impact, and societal benefit. Many institutions talk that talk, but very few walk the walk the way that Imperial does. Delighted you could join us for our annual Grantham Lecture. It's a great pleasure today to welcome Brian Eno to deliver his keynote speech, The Ever-Growing Climate Movement, Creating and Shaping Climate Change Narratives Through Culture, Creativity and Innovation. Brian is a highly influential musician, producer, visual artist, and activist who, as co-founder of Earth%, is reforming the music industry's action towards climate change. We're also joined, and there's a hint here, by a wonderful panel. We have panelists Nilesha Chauvet, Jason Taylor, Kylie McLaughlin, and our chair, Baroness Young of Hornsey, who you'll be hearing from later. The Grantham Institute for Climate Change and the Environment is one of our 6 global institutes at Imperial, established to promote interdisciplinary working and to meet some of the greatest challenges faced by society. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Grantham Foundation for the Protection of the Environment for their long-standing support for our institute since they enabled its launch in February 2007. The institute is driving forward discovery, converting actions into applications, training future leaders, and communicating academic knowledge to businesses, industry, and policymakers to help them shape their decisions. It's particularly timely, of course, that this year's lecture comes so soon after COP27. And as we'll, I'm sure, hear about and talk about, COP27 saw some progress in how rich polluting countries can provide finance for the loss and damage that vulnerable countries face from climate extremes. Progress that's worth celebrating, but I think we all came away disappointed that there was not further action, for example, set out for countries to urgently reduce their emissions and phase out fossil fuels. Very relevant, I think, to this evening's event is that I think COP27 perhaps highlighted more than ever how creative climate responses are taking place all over the world. Perhaps are not yet considered as central solutions to climate change and climate justice, but yet have so much potential and must be so much part of future debate and future action. I'll shortly hand over to Professor Sir Brian Hoskins, Founding Director and now Chair of the Grantham Institute for Climate Change and the Environment, to share his experiences over the years and to introduce Brian Eno. But before I do that, after you've enjoyed this part of the evening, I hope that you will enjoy the reception where you can explore exhibits of Imperial researchers and meet our startup companies that are tackling environmental issues. So welcome again to Imperial College. Enjoy the evening, and Brian, over to you.
Well, thank you, Hugh, and welcome everyone. I gave my first talk on global warming in 1975, my first public talk. and that's 47 years ago. So you could say climate scientists like me have been total failure in telling the world what should be done. And it's clear that climate scientists cannot do the whole job. What we're looking for is a transformation of society and our whole way of life. And that needs all ways of telling people what's going on, involving people. And crucial in this is art, music, and culture in all ways. So it really is delightful to host this rather different Grantham Institute Annual Lecture this evening. Now, before we actually get on with the proceedings, I need to give a few housekeeping reminders. We've been asked for no photos or personal recordings, please, but there will be an official recording of the event, and that will be available to you. And I don't know whether this is necessary, but commenting online in Teams or asking questions in Mentimeter, please make sure you are respectful, okay? And do post your questions as we go. Tag us on social media at Grantham _IC. And live captions will appear as a toggleable option for viewers on Teams, and there'll be translation in 5 languages. Right, well, so that's got rid of that one. Right, so the structure of the event tonight, there'll be this keynote lecture by Brian Eno, and then a panel discussion, and then open up the floor to questions from the audience. So it really is a great pleasure to introduce Brian Eno here. As a musician, he first came to international prominence in the early 70s, not too far from when I was giving that talk, I think, as a founding member of a British band, Roxy Music. And this was followed by a series of solo albums and collaborations. And then as a producer, he's worked with groups from Talking Heads to Coldplay and many others, and collaborations with David Bowie and many others, visual experiments with light and video, and paralleling his music career and exhibitions and installations all over the globe. And an activist too. He's a founding member of the Long Now Foundation, a trustee of Client Earth, and a patron of Videre Est Credere. In April 2021, he launched Earth%, which raises money from the music industry for some of the most impactful environmental charities working on the climate emergency. Brian Eno, welcome to Imperial College, and the podium is yours.
Thank you very much. I used to teach sometimes just across the road at the Royal College of Art, and I always thought I'd love to teach at ICL. So here's my first chance. So when we think about people involving themselves with climate change, it's quite easy to see how scientists can do that. You know, we immediately think, well, couldn't you invent some way of sucking carbon out of the air, or couldn't you think of some way of making fusion reactors work? Or we can think of a lot of scientific projects that would actually use science quite fully and fundamentally. When you say to people, what do you think art could do? Their imaginations sort of stop at posters and songs that have words that have something to do with climate change. And that to me is fine, you know, we need that kind of thing as well, but it's a little bit like marketing. It's a little bit like if your only hope for what science could do in the climate change fight was to come up with louder megaphones so we could shout louder at demonstrations or something like that. It's not working at the fundamental level that I think art can work at, and it's that I would like to talk about, really. What I'm really talking about is, what do artists do? Now, I think most people don't really have much of an idea about that, including most artists. About 20 years ago, I have quite a few scientist friends, so I'm often in the company of scientists. So I decided to do a little experiment, which was to ask 20 scientists and 20 artists the same question, which was, what are you actually doing? So talking to the scientists, I got fairly similar answers. I'm interested in this part of the world and I want to understand how it works. I'm interested in seeing how this happens, how this comes into being, how this functions, something like that. They were all pretty much the same kind of answer, except for one guy who said, how else would a guy like me get a girlfriend? When I asked the same question of artists, there was very little consensus in the answers. First of all, quite a few of them said things like, it's none of your business. And generally, I got the impression that artists were a little bit frightened to ask that question. They didn't really want to be, to possibly burst the bubble of this mysterious talent that most of them had for making art. Well, I've always been interested in that question and always wanted to see if I could burst that bubble. So I started to think, when I was about 17, actually, I started with the question, what do artists actually do? And this was really spurred by the lady who became my mother-in-law, who was a friend of Francis Crick and various other scientists, and they all used to gather in the caravan she lived in on Sundays to drink her beer and to talk about cutting-edge science. And I was sometimes part of these conversations, a rather quiet part of the conversations. And one day she said to me, Brian, it's terribly nice having you here, but it's such a shame that somebody with a mind like yours would waste it being an artist. And this really challenged me. So I started then to think about what is art for? Why are we doing it? And furthermore, why are we interested in looking at it? So I started by, the first clue to an answer to this came to looking at what children do. How do children learn? Well, of course, they play. And nobody would say of a child, well, they're just wasting their time. One day they'll do something serious. Playing is fundamental. It's not only beautiful to watch, it's exciting, it's thrilling, and it's charming, but it's crucial as well. It's how children find out about the world. They set up little experiments all the time. So it's not only how people become artists, it's how they become scientists as well. That some children set up experiments where they take things apart. They look at things in the real world. Those people often become scientists. Some children play Let's Pretend, where they imagine other worlds, where they start to think, what would happen if you had a world where he could jump right over that, or something similar. Those children often, it seems to me, become artists. Their interest is in trying to find out what happens if. What if? That's the sort of central question of childhood, really. So these kids are making these sort of models of bits of the world that exist or bits of the world that they would like to imagine. And they become, like all of us, quite good at the dynamics of that. That's how they understand social spaces, they understand materials, they understand how things do things, how things come into being, how things fall apart. All of the important questions of life start to be studied by children in play. So then at a certain point, children go to school where they're often told to stop playing and do something serious. And thus it continues into adulthood, where you have examinations and so on, which filter out the kids who won't stop playing effectively. A lot of those end up in art schools, by the way, like I did. And then we enter adulthood, and now we get a job and we do serious things. But it occurred to me that it's not possible, surely, that this fascination and curiosity that we have with either the worlds we see or the worlds we invent should disappear as childhood ends. And of course it doesn't. It turns into art and science. It turns into art where people actually pay you to imagine worlds that didn't previously exist. You make a living of imagining things, imagining new worlds. And if you think about what adults do actually for entertainment, they do things like read books. What's a novel, really? It's a new world. It's a world that you're invited to immerse yourself into and see how it works. As you read it, you make guesses about what's going to happen. You check your guesses against what actually happens. It's a laboratory. It's a way of thinking about other ways the world could be. Now, isn't that, in a sense, just about the most important thing that humans could occupy themselves with? We're faced with a constantly developing, evolving, and very surprising world that keeps throwing novelty at us. So we need some skills in dealing with that. We need to be able to answer what-if questions with some kind of experience, with some expertise behind us. And I think this is why we love novels so much. We love novels because we love novelty. We want to know what will happen if such and such a thing is the case. So if you think of, take a novel like Brave New World, which probably most of us have read, that's a way of experiencing what a totalitarian state might be like, without actually having to live in one. The important thing of art is that it's safe. The important thing is that you can have quite extreme emotional experiences and you can switch them off, or you can shut the book. So you start to be able to understand. It's rather like a flight simulator. You know, I flew a 747 once in a flight simulator and crashed it, in fact. 480 people dead. I'm still feeling bad about it. But the most interesting thing about it was the level of engagement. I was absolutely covered in sweat by the time I finished. We're very capable of having all the emotional experiences of quite extreme events, even when they're simulated, when they're a flight simulator, or it's a movie, or it's a book. So we learn a lot about things by studying them in simulation. Now, you can learn a lot about, I don't know, growing up gay in Glasgow from reading Shuggie Bain, that novel that won the Booker Prize a couple of years ago. Or you can learn a lot about what it's like to start to become insane by reading Diary of a Madman by Gogol. So all of those things not only give us a sense of how the world works, but they give us an empathy for the characters within it as well. We start to understand what it's like to be in somebody else's mind, which of course is another fundamental human skill. It's on that basis that we're able to cooperate with each other. We're able to cooperate because we can kind of guess what's going on in somebody else's mind. It's called theory of mind, and humans have it in buckets, and animals don't seem to have it quite as much as us. It gives us another possibility as well. I could say something to you that was a quite complicated question. I could say, do you think we're living in 1984, or are we living in Brave New World? And if you've read both of those books, which a lot of people will have done, you would be able to form an opinion on that. But think about that question. Think of what a sophisticated question that is. I'm saying, do you think you're living in this kind of world, which would take me probably 20 minutes to describe, or that kind of world, which would take me another 20 minutes to describe? One of the things that culture objects do is they give us packages of ideas like that. Brave New World is not just a story, it's a package of ideas about the relationship between individuals and state. 1984 is the same thing. They're sort of parcels that you can then use in conversation as you would use single words. I can know that we're talking about the same thing because we're referring to this same book. Similarly, I could say, what do you think about Versailles? With the magnificent building of Versailles. And that too is a package of ideas. It's a set of assumptions about the relationship of human beings to nature, about social hierarchy. The relationship of humans to nature in that case is one of total control. If you've ever been there, you'll see that every tree is manicured into some sort of geometrical shape. so that it has nothing of its original tree-like form, and it becomes something that humans have designed. So this, immediately you see this, you think this is an attitude. It's not just a tree, it's an attitude. It's the summation of a theory about how we relate to nature. And part of that theory is, of course, that there's a pyramid with God at the top, French nobles at the second place, dogs and horses in the third, French women, then the English. And so, you know, it's a pyramid theory, a pyramid plan. And again, if you look at, I don't know, another building like a cathedral, that's a different proposition. That's about the relationship of humans with whatever they think is non-human, whatever they think is divine. Another building you might look at is a shopping mall. What does that mean? Well, that's the sort of consumerist democracy of you can buy whatever you like as long as you've got the money. These are all not only what they appear to be, they're also a set of relationships, and we all understand them. We all read those pretty well. And I'm saying this because quite often the objection to this idea that we are always in the business in art of creating other worlds is people say, well, I can see that with a novel or with a film, but how does it apply to an earring or a cardigan that somebody's knitted? It's a long story, but I'm sure my fellow guests will tell you some of that when they come on. So what is the product of all of this experiencing, since it's all virtual anyway? What do we learn from it? I think the product is to do with feelings. Now, talking about feelings in a science establishment is kind of dodgy, because feelings are inherently unquantifiable. They're difficult to compare. They're evanescent. We don't know whether what I call melancholy is the same as what you call melancholy, and so on and so on. So they're hard to deal with. And in fact, they've largely been left out of science. Even the sciences of neurology and so on don't talk much about feelings. They talk about more mechanical things, like where is the speech center located, for instance. Feelings are, in fact, I often say to artists, and they don't very much like it when I do, artists are basically feeling mongers. That's what we do. We make things that give you feelings. What else do we do? There's no other result, really. We make paintings, but why do they exist? To give you feelings. But like scientists, artists don't like the word feelings very much because it's so floppy and so fluffy and so difficult to grasp. So I want to quote from a neuropsychologist called Mark Solms, who published a very interesting book a couple of years ago called The Hidden Spring. He says, the idea that feelings and emotions are fluffy things, nothing could be further from the truth. So they're much more important to our survival than, for example, analytical philosophy. And then he goes on to say, feeling is a demand on the mind to perform work. Cognition is that work. Please note this hierarchy. First comes the need, which you feel, and second comes the response to that need. And that response might be, let me think my way through this problem. So I think the mistake we've made in the climate movement is assuming that humans are primarily sort of information processors. We think of them as kind of computers, and if we stick enough data in, they're bound to respond in some way or another. And that clearly hasn't worked. As Brian said before, he's been doing this for 47 years, and we're in a worse place now than we were then, a much worse place. We all know the information. Information isn't changing our mind. And in fact, I think information doesn't often change our mind. Now, you're a particular subset of the population in that you're scientists who live on information. You thrive on it. You are not typical in that respect. Most people, in fact, even including you, make their most important decisions not on the basis of information, because there often isn't enough, but on the basis of feelings. If you think about the important decisions in your life, which football club you support, who you marry, what sort of politics you're affiliated to, what kind of house you live in, the way you style that house and so on. Those are decisions that are essentially made on the basis of feelings. Now, people say, oh, well, that's a bad way to make choices, but actually it's often the only way you have. There isn't enough hard data to make judgments any other way. So Solmes's thought is that feeling is really the beginning of thinking. Feeling is at the root of thinking. A feeling precedes the thought. The thought is an attempt to articulate and act upon the feeling. So this is quite a kind of reversal of the normal idea we have. We normally think we have ideas, and then they give us feelings. But actually, before we have ideas, we have feelings, which lead to those ideas. So you can see, I think, I'm just looking at the clock here, I'm okay. You can see why, being a feelings monger myself, I start to think there's a relationship between how we can solve this very important problem of how do we change minds? How do minds change? What changes minds? And it turns out it's changes in feelings, actually, that change minds very often. There are particular cases where we have enough data to say we can prove this to be the case, or we can actually disprove all these other things. That's science, and that's good. Science is good at that, and art doesn't even try to do it. Art says, you do that job, we'll stick with the feelings, please. So what does art actually end up doing? First thing it does, I think, it changes our sense of what's valuable. To give you an example of that, landscape painting, which appeared in the sort of 18th century, really, didn't really exist before. Nobody thought landscapes were that interesting. They thought people were interesting, and battles were interesting, and horses were interesting. They've always been interesting. And landscape was an idea that occurred at a certain point when we started to lose it. When people started to move into cities and started building coal mines and big industrial smoky factories, they then started to look at landscape, and that suddenly became a thought, an idea. Another thing that art does, I think, is it synchronizes people's thinking. Now, I had a very good example of this a few years ago. I was on a bus coming down the road from Kilburn, and there were two ladies behind me, ordinary Kilburn working class ladies, who had talking about what they'd seen the night before on EastEnders. And this particular EastEnders was a young woman coming out to her family saying that she was gay. And the ladies behind me were discussing, should she have told her fiancé, who she was due to marry, should she have told him before she told the parents, and so on and so on. All these issues about this problem of being gay in the 20th century, 21st, no, 20th it was then. I was listening to their conversation and thinking, this is not a conversation they could have probably had about a real person. They were talking totally hypothetically because this was a hypothetical situation. It was a story. It was something on television. It wasn't a true story. So they were able to say, oh, she should have done that. I think it would have been better if he'd done that, so on. They were rethinking this story over and over. And I thought, so probably all over England on this morning, the morning after that was broadcast, there are people having those same conversations. Hundreds of thousands of them, probably. And I thought, this is very interesting. It's a way that people synchronize their feelings about things. People want to know what everybody else thinks. People are not solo rationalists. They want to know what the feeling is around them. What is permissible now? agree on, what do we disagree on? In fact, I want to quote from a very interesting woman called Carmody Gray, who's a Catholic theologian. She says, the idea that human beings are rational, solitary agents who make up their minds all by themselves based on something called facts is an absolute fiction. And she, being, of course, a Catholic theologian, she therefore puts a lot of faith in faith. And funnily, being an ex-Catholic atheist, I am finding it more and more the case that I agree with her. She also says, science needs to connect with something that I really care about, and I learn what to care about from the narratives and the communities that I'm embedded in. So I think what she's saying there is that we're all of us all the time sort of absorbing the consensus of feeling about different things. What can we talk about? What can't we talk about? What do we tend to think is repulsive? What do we tend to think is attractive? And of course, a lot of that comes from popular culture. Not only popular, but all sorts of culture. Most of it doesn't come from philosophers talking rationally about what we should and shouldn't believe, or from scientists saying, in a quantifiable sense, you should believe this rather than this. That is not how we make most of our decisions. We make it on the basis of what we find people doing and people liking. We're constantly building the world, and we need help with it. And that help comes from each other. We need to be able to cooperate. So now, after all of that, I shall get on to climate change. I think I've still got a few minutes left. I think what has been the problem so far is that it's all stick and no carrot. Everything you hear about climate change is bad news. There's no vision that there might be something worth fighting for rather than fighting against. And let's start thinking about that a little bit, because what everybody in the climate change movement is saying is, we've got to change everything, we've got to change things. And we know what sorts of changes they are. They involve engaging the world's population in a way that we haven't done before. That means people in developing countries as well as developed countries. It means women as well as men. It means ethnic groups that we've ignored. It means something that liberals and people on the left have been saying for a long time would be a good idea. Well, here's our alibi to actually do it. We can get away with it now. What it really means is it's rethinking the way the world works now. As I said, we've all got a lot of experience in doing that. That's what we do all the time. We rethink how worlds could work. What we need to be doing now is starting to pay attention to the fact that there is a huge movement already in progress. And we're all part of it, or nearly all of us, and most of us don't notice it. A few weeks ago, I was in Barcelona at a conference, and it was a climate change conference, and there were at least 120 organizations represented there, all dealing with climate change in some way or another, none of which I'd ever heard of before. And I made lots of acquaintances and friends there, and I thought probably at this moment across the globe there are 60 or 100 other meetings like this going on. And probably there are going to be another 60 or 100 next week, and so on and so on. And they're all people meeting and getting to know each other, and it's like this kind of dense mycelium is growing under our feet. But we're not really aware of it. Nobody's actually looked around and said, hey, they're all doing it. There's a Russian historian called Sergei Yurchak who says revolutions happen in two phases. The first is when everyone realizes something is wrong. And the second is when everyone realizes that everyone else realizes it as well. And this is the point we're reaching now, I think. There's a sort of coalescence starting to happen. And this is the really good news, that it's starting to join up. I better stop now because I have to invite my fellow panelists on stage, and perhaps the rest of what I was going to say I can somehow fit into that. So get them on. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Brian. That was great. Great. Thank you. Right, whilst everybody's getting settled, I've got to pretend I'm not technologically challenged this evening and sort of just glide through all of the things that we have to do. But thank you again, Brian, for a wonderful introduction to our conversation. And I hope it will be a conversation, albeit mediated by QR codes and the like. So as you can see up here, we have a QR code. And if you want to log on to that, that'd be great. We're taking questions via, I can't remember the name of the software, but you know the kind of thing that how it works. You put your question in and we'll address that according to how popular your question is. And so that will be very interesting to move on to. But first, I should introduce myself. I'm Lola Young, and I'm an independent member of the House of Lords. And my interests have really been around, very broadly speaking, around social justice issues across the years. More recently, thinking about how the intersection between social justice and racial justice and environmental justice is absolutely critical to finding a way out of what this situation in which we find ourselves. And like Brian, I have a great deal of faith in art and artists in its broadest conceptualization as being part of the key to getting everybody to understand the urgency, or as many people as possible. There'll be some people that you will never persuade, and that doesn't matter how clever you are. So anyway, we're here this evening to, as I say, address some of your questions. And I'm going to introduce just very briefly the panel so that they can introduce themselves properly. And I'll start with Carly. Would you like to introduce yourself, please?
I'm Kylie McLaughlin. I'm Professor of Climate and Energy Policy at the University of Manchester, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research.
Thank you very much, Nilesh.
Hi, very nice to meet you all. It's such a pleasure to be here. My name is Nilesha Chauvet, and I'm the Managing Director of a creative and strategy marketing communications agency called The Good Agency. So very nice to meet you all.
And Jason.
Hi, my name's Jason Decaris Taylor, and I'm a sculptor who's spent the last 20 years working in an unusual space underwater, so working in different oceans around the planet and creating installations for visitors to go and see.
Brilliant, thank you very much indeed. So we've got, as I say, this QR code, and so I hope some of you have already logged on to that. Is that right? Some of you already logged on and starting to, great, I can see some people here engaging, interacting. And there is a voting code there, which is 61, is it up there? No, it's 61765466. So voting code, oh yeah, it is there, 61765466 in order to answer a few questions related to today's topic. So we've got a few questions here which have emerged, will emerge, I think, as a word cloud. Questions are quite general, but so just to get you going, what does culture mean to you? Is one question. Maybe that's something we could just have a quick kind of round with everybody on. What does culture mean to you? Brian, you've already kind of said, but maybe you can expand a little bit more around that?
Since I've talked a lot, I'll give a short answer.
Yes.
It's everything you don't have to do. So you have to eat, but you don't have to invent cuisines. You have to wear clothes, but you don't have to get Yves Saint Laurent or Balenciaga or something. There's a lot of things that we have to do to survive, and then on top of those, there's a whole lot of things that we call ornamentation or decoration or whatever you like. And the interesting question is, why do we do those?
Very interesting. Carly.
Oh, I don't think I can compete with that answer.
Go on.
No, I mean, I really do. I'll pass on.
I think it's such a difficult question, isn't it? It's like saying, what is art? So for me personally, and I think this is just a very subjective opinion, informed by marketing communications, is I think that culture is about human behaviour. And in terms of what people are doing now, what ideas are being generated, what conversations are being sparked, and what people are talking about. And what issues are preoccupying us at this current time. For me, all of those things is what really defines culture.
Mm-hmm.
Jason.
I think, it's how we interpret the world, it's how we understand our surroundings, how we relate to each other, how we communicate. It's about emotions, what Brian was talking about. I think it's vital.
Mm.
Great. So I think I draw from that there are as many interpretations of that question as there are people on the planet virtually. Mm-hmm. It means so much that's different to everybody. And we use culture in a very kind of expansive way to mean lots of different things. But okay, so I won't go through all of these questions with our panelists, but we've got what does culture mean to you? What does creativity mean to you is another question, I think, on your list. And when you think of climate change, what comes to mind? Which of the following influences your reactions to and understanding of climate change the most? Scientific information, art on climate change, music on climate change, advertisements on climate change. So a lot of the themes that have been raised by Brian in his keynote. So I don't know, are we going to see the results of those questions? No? No, okay, we're not seeing the results of those questions. Not yet, anyway. Maybe we'll be let into those later. So we're now going to sort of move into the discussion proper, as it were. And we've got some more taxing questions, but there's no dodging them this time, Carly. I'm looking at you.
I feel more confident with where we're going.
Yeah, not going to dodge them this time. So if you think about the industry, the respective industries in which you are involved, could you say something about how it's shaped, where you work has shaped the collective mobilization towards climate action? Now, embedded in that question are lots of kind of assumptions, some of which you may wish to challenge. But by and large, how has your industry, the industry in which you work, helped to change people's minds or influence the way people feel about climate change? Nilesh, I'm going to come to you first, because I think you're the most appropriate person.
Well, I don't know about that, but I suppose for marketeers and communication experts, it all starts with the audience. So if we're talking about how do we mobilize people, how do we get them interested in a topic, how do we get them to move and to act, it really must start with understanding your audience. And I think one of the challenges in this space is that when we're talking about climate change, it's such a huge issue, isn't it? And how do we make it really personal? So we do, and who are we talking to exactly? Because we are all different. And we come from different cultures, we have different perspectives, we come from different disciplines. How you talk to a scientist might be very different to how you might talk to a musician. So really understanding the audience is key. And in the marketing communication space, you would start with insight. So you would start with segmenting the audience, really identifying the target of who it is you want to speak to. And then you would really understand what is the insight here, what is the audience insight that will help us to connect a story to that audience. And making sure then that when we're crafting the story, so when we're developing campaigns and marketing communications, it's always about the insight. And any creativity that comes from the insight is really the dramatization of that insight. And it is actually from the emotional space. So it's got to be something that's emotional, backed by rigor, strategic rigor. Believe it or not, there's a lot of rigor, strategic rigor in marketing and communications. We do think a lot and plan a lot. It's actually quite a sophisticated process when you're studying a particular audience and then developing a story in order to connect to that audience and then working out how we reach them. in terms of what channels we might be deploying. Is it a digital strategy, or is it something that's above the line, or now we're very fond of saying there is no line, it's all integrated. So it's a very complex process, but what we're talking about is really how do we connect? How do we take our audience on a journey through using the marketing principles of raising awareness, educating the audience, keeping it really simple? How do we then get them to consider a particular issue? How do we then get them to engage with it? And how do we then get them to take action? There's probably a couple of references to campaigns that I could probably show you that would dramatise this so much better than I can actually articulate. And I wonder if it's possible to queue up an ad, because it might be nice for you. Would you like to see an ad that I think is really cool, that helps to really mobilise? So this one is by Sport England, and it's a campaign called This Girl Can. And it's a really great example of how you mobilise, in this case, women, to get really excited about exercising. Bearing in mind that in this particular instance, women were confronted with unrealistic stereotypes of body image. They had some anxiety about getting involved in exercise. So this is a great campaign that had phenomenal success in getting women just really excited about taking part and creating a movement. And when we're talking about mobilisation, we want to create a movement. So, can we play the ad? This is the million-dollar question. We're going to play the ad. Great.
Shall I tell a story in the meantime?
Yes.
Carmody Gray, who I mentioned earlier, the Catholic theologian, told a very interesting story of a friend of hers who was a chain smoker who wouldn't give up smoking despite all her friends and family saying, it's terrible, it's going to shorten your life, so on and so on and so on. And then this lady became pregnant and immediately stopped smoking. And the point of that story is that the love that she felt for that child was more motivating for her than the truth. So love is more motivating than truth. So it's another example of how we process information, actually. It's all the statistics in the world hadn't convinced her in 45 years to stop smoking, but suddenly knowing she had a child and a responsibility to somebody, that changed her. And I only said that to sort of fill in the time. Well, is it going to happen? I'll just carry on.
Is the ad ready yet? Because if not, we can carry on for a bit.
We can
because
watch it later. Let's move on.
Yeah, it's interesting, that thing about feelings and emotion, because some people don't like to admit that they're influenced by feeling and emotion, and hardly anybody likes to admit they've been influenced by an advertisement.
Yeah.
Right? So it's kind of interesting to use those kinds of tools particularly in this context. But Jason, perhaps I could ask you whilst we're waiting. So obviously you're a visual artist, but most people can't get to your work to see your work, can they?
It does certainly require some kind of effort, but that's been one of the sort of big objectives, is to try to sort of connect people back to nature, to get people to look at climate change in a tangible, in a real way, in an environment. Obviously, the oceans are, I think, at the forefront of climate change. Some of the changes that are happening there, have huge implications. So I really tried to sort of focus, and I tried to think of my works as portals that sort of allow access to this world that is not generally, very understood. And also by kind of, I don't like to use the word marketing it, but by changing the sort of value system of how we think about things. I think a lot of people think of oceans as these huge resources that we can just extract what we like from, when actually they're incredibly sort of sacred areas. They're in amazing spaces. It's, we explore the moon and all these places, but we know so little about what's, on our blue planet. So, for me, it's about re-establishing that connection and making people feel and have empathy for what's down there.
Does anyone in the audience know what his work is like? 'Cause maybe it would help if you just quickly described a piece.
Sure. To be honest, this is a little bit unusual for me, and I'm a little bit uncomfortable without actually having images. And I actually never do radio interviews because I find it so abstract that it's hard to relate to. But basically, I make large-scale sculptures in quite large numbers that create these artificial reefs. So they have several objectives. One is to obviously create an attraction, but it's to draw people away from fragile areas, from natural reefs that, if they're visited too often, can start to degrade. So it's to create these sort of sanctuaries that also have marine protected areas around them. And then within the works themselves, I've been focusing on climate change issues for around 15 years, and I generally start by taking castings of local communities and then transporting them into this underwater world and monitoring how they've changed. And some are large-scale sculptures that are 6 meters tall, some are hundreds, like terracotta armies, others are buildings that are underwater. And I've even done one on the Thames in London, which was a series called The Horsemen of the Apocalypse, where they were subject to the rise and fall of the Thames.
Thank you very much for that. I mean, I don't think you actually have to go and visit them literally underwater to feel the impact of the work. So I hope that your website and etc. is available to everybody so that they can have a look at them on YouTube perhaps or elsewhere.
Sure. Underwater sculpture.
Great. So I think now we've got the ad ready, so we'll see. Thank you.
I'm the hottest round, and if you want me, y'all can stop me now. Since you with me now, the biggie bounce. I know you think the way I switch my style. Get your freak on, 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 get your freak on. People here I come, and sweat me when I'm done. Now people gather round, now people jump around. Get your freak on, get your freak on.
I'm knackered. That's a really good example, isn't it? Because to Brian's earlier points it's about feelings and emotion and sort of connecting with people on a particular level. You can say all you like, your BMI should be this, and if you smoke, this will happen to you. And some people will be, moved to do something different as a result of that. But then it's also what I like about that, and I think the campaign was really brilliant. I agree with you. Is that it allows everybody to feel included in that.
Absolutely.
It's not like you have to be an expert on being in the gym or whatever, or look a particular way. So I think it's a really good lesson there for us. But Brian, can I come to you? We will shortly go to the Q&A with colleagues out in the audience and online. But I just wanted to ask all of you again, what's the right messaging? Maybe not right isn't the right word, but what do you think is the most effective way of getting these messages across? To take your smoking example, you can see the blackened lungs on the packet. You can have your doctor tell you you've got to give it up. You can get pregnant and feel that that's the moment to do it. Is it fear? So is that based on fear and anxiety, or should we be thinking about how to make things sound really joyous and having wonderful aesthetic experience, or is it a mixture of lots of different strategies?
I think it's two things. One is falling in love with the world again. You don't hurt the things you love, you protect them. And I point to people like David Attenborough as great examples of people starting that movement to happen. And I think my daughter's generation, I've got 3 daughters, but they are in that process now of finding beauty in the world in a way that I don't think I ever did, and finding an understanding of the intricacy of it and the interconnectedness of it. So that's the first thing I'd say. The second thing is this thing of trying to provide some carrot as well as some stick. The stick hasn't worked. You know, we've been beaten over the head for years with how bad things are. And the biggest reaction to that is powerlessness. You feel there's nothing I can do. Well, I might as well just grab as much as I can now and buy a part of New Zealand or something, which is, of course, what Peter Thiel and others have done. There's got to be some kind of vision of some reason, you know, as Carmody Gray, who I keep quoting, said, why do we keep talking about sustainability if we don't say what it is we're trying to sustain? At the moment, we're talking about sustainability, but saying everything's going down the tubes. Well, we have to sort of think that there's something we want to sustain. And for me, it's human life and the love that connects people. And I think that is worth fighting for. You know, as far as we know, we're the only life in the universe. This is the only place it happened. This is the most extraordinary fact that we all walk around with and don't think about at all. We now know that there are, I can't even remember the number, 300 trillion stars or something like that, which means there must be about twice that number of exoplanets, which means there ought to be lots of life out there. As far as we know, there's only us. And to fuck that experiment, to fuck that up will be the greatest disappointment.
Disappointment is putting it somewhat mildly, I would suggest. It is very complicated, though, isn't it? Because in order to love, you have to be in a good place, don't you? In some respects, I mean, you know, people who are filled with anxiety, fear, hatred, it can be difficult to learn how to love, especially something that feels quite abstract. And you're right about the term sustainability itself feels like it's a concept, isn't it? Because it means so many different things in so many different contexts. So it's still quite a difficult thing that you're asking of people, I think.
But the people who really know how to love are the people who need each other. And those are often the poor people. They're not the people at the top of the heap, generally. The people who run gospel churches where they help out old ladies and people out of jobs and so on, they know about love because they need each other. The richest among us are so atomized and so independent of one another that we don't need to love that much. We have to shed some of that independence. Sorry, I'm doing all the talking.
No, it's all right. I just wanted to ask Carly because, you know, you're an academic, you teach around climate change. What about all this stuff about feelings and love? How does that work? How would that work in your work?
So I think I think the word, you know, you gave us a set of options of what the key thing might be. I think the key thing for me at the moment is agency. And it's similar to what you've been talking about, Brian, that people have to be able to see how they can be part of something different and what that different looks like. One of the things that we say a lot in climate change stuff that I don't really love is that we're going to have to change everything and everything has to be completely transformed. But then we stop at that point. Well, that is absolutely terrifying for people. And we need to much more create a vision of what that's like. And actually, what will we be doing in this transformed world? You know, we'll still be eating great food. We'll still be spending time with the people that we love. We'll live in a warm, comfortable home where in that warm, comfortable home, you were hopefully not living in fuel poverty, as many people increasingly are now, and the profits of buying that energy are much more likely to be being shared locally, or at least nationally, and reinvested nationally. So I think this idea of presenting a vision is really, really important. Pathways for people that give them agency, but not reducing people to their consumption choices. And we do that over and over again. Yeah. We have got so many roles as humans in the world. We can create so much change. So when we're talking about engaging like an audience, for example, we often go down this route of, and here's the top 5 things you could do to reduce the carbon footprint of what you buy. But what we don't talk about is how could you support campaigns to say no new oil and gas extraction? And I think we need to open up the kinds of roles that we see for people when we're engaging much more if we want to give them those different types of agency.
I think, again, I'm here to kind of, problematize everything everybody says, basically, in the interest, all in the good cause, because I want to try and understand what do we say to people. People often ask me, because I've done quite a lot of work around fashion and sustainability, which includes, in my view, things like modern slavery and exploitative labour practices in the industry. They're very interconnected, these things. So, but people will say, what should I do? What can I do? And so for some people to say, well, actually what you need to do maybe is, recycle your clothing, or, don't buy anything new for 6 months or whatever. And that will suit some people. But other people, there's some projects that I know of which are about growing food locally. So people, it's not that it's got to be some big, huge project or going out and lying in the road, because those kinds of strategies don't work for everybody.
Yeah, I think that's right. They don't work for everyone. But I think, the lying in the road example is really interesting. And I thought of it when you were talking earlier, Brian, around that's creating a sort of national and international conversation for people, and people are positioning their own views on climate change and what we need to do about it, how we should structure energy markets and the economy in relation to what are these people doing when they block the M25. And I think it's really interesting, if you look at what people are talking about, it doesn't now tend to be that they're talking about climate denialism, that you might have phrased it as before. Mm-hmm. You get some discourses of climate delay, but actually, I think it's creating a space for a national conversation about the things people want, so that they can be given pathways to like decarbonise in their own life, but through these range of options, some of which you've talked about there. But it is about creating those opportunities. So there are people entering fashion markets in ways that are much more like a sort of service base and rental and things like that. And I think increasingly people do feel uncomfortable, but then they need a way out of it. No point just making everyone feel uncomfortable with nothing to do about it.
Absolutely. So, Jason, again, this issue of how you draw people into rethinking, resetting perhaps their views, including their views on what they can actually do.
I mean, I think just the act of being creative is something that's positive and hopeful in its essence. But for me, definitely, I've actually experimented over the years by doing different artworks that are critical or hopeful, or which have a particular kind of empathy. And it's really interesting sort of gauging their responses. And I'm more maybe on the cynical side, or I'm more on the angry side, where I'm livid by what's happened. And when I kind of show some of those images, they get the least amount of engagement and following. But when I do something that's hopeful or positive, or I show coral restoration, or I show humans living in a symbiotic relationship, then it's so much more engagement. I'm a little bit skeptical because I'm judging a lot on social media, which is algorithmic and lots of other factors in it. But I definitely think that, it's about having a vision, and we've got nothing left but to think that way.
Thank you. And Nilesh, come to you.
So I think, going back to your question, which is, what's the right thing to say? I think, looking at this from a purist perspective, the right thing to say is always the truth. I think we need to tell the truth. But how we do that is really the million-dollar question. And I think what you're highlighting is that we do need to develop more optimistic narratives because it has been so doom and gloom. It's very difficult to engage with that. If we're going back to the audience and where they are and how people are feeling in this country in general, we've come out of a pandemic and we're suffering from crisis fatigue because now we're in a cost of living crisis. We are seeing the effects of climate change. We understand now that something bad is happening and we have to take some action. So I think there are two things here. I think one is that there is still not enough of the truth being told. And I think that certainly from a marketing communications perspective, one of the things that we need to look at is how we really avoid things like greenwashing and purpose washing. And what we can do is hold businesses to account. So I think that there's not enough true radical transparency and truth-telling. And the recent IPCC report on responsible business highlights that many businesses have said and made pledges that they would do this or that or take responsibility, but they are massively behind on their targets, pretty much every single one of them. That cannot be an acceptable or sustainable place for us to be in. I think, secondly, it is about, however, maintaining or trying to still paint a picture of the world that we all want to live in and the world that we want to bequeath to our children, because they deserve some hope. We all need some hope because people will not engage in a conversation that is doom and gloom. So I think one of the things that we look at in marketing communications is how do we reconcile those two things? How do we tell the truth, but in a way that people can get behind, people can feel excited about the future, and they can get engaged with the solutions that we are proposing and that intelligent people, like scientists, are proposing to the world.
Thank you very much for that. I'm sort of minded to mention legislation because that's not something that we've really talked about. But when you talk about responsible business, there'll be businesses that tell you that, you know, voluntary is the best way. And we know where that's led us, actually, you know, sort of nowhere really. So the EU are currently looking at legislation on mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence.
Jolly lucky we left then, isn't it?
Well, it doesn't matter in terms of British businesses because if they want to trade in Europe, they'll still have to comply with the law.
Yeah.
And there are laws that are popping up all over the world around this area. So I think, you know, I'm not saying that legislation is a magic bullet of any kind, and there'll always be some that slip out from under those kinds of regulatory mechanisms. Nonetheless, you know, I think it's incumbent upon governments everywhere to do that work and to make it clear that it's not acceptable to behave in the way that businesses do. I mean, one of my beefs is, I have to say, that, you know, yes, I can go around turning off my lights and turning off the television and all the rest of it. At the end of the day, when I see an office block, you know, hugely lit and nobody in it, you know, what's my little bit of action going to be worth? So I think corporations really need to get on board much, much more than they have done so far. So I think we're now ready to go to, I can't read that small screen. I can't read the lettering on there. I'm going to have to look up here. We're going to go to the questions that we've had both online and from those of you who are present here. We've got some a democratic process here whereby those with the most votes go to the top. So I'm going to have to stand up, actually, because I haven't got the specs.
Shall I read it?
So the fossil fuel lobbyists are well aware of the power of feelings and utilise them effectively while greenwashing. How do we counter this? That's a very good question in the context of some of the things that have just been said. Carly, would you like to kick off?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to come back to this later, so I'm really glad that question's there. I think, you know, we're talking here about loads of positive discourses and narratives, and there is an incumbent lobby who want to delay that. And I think we often sit around talking as if there isn't this massive elephant that is working against all of the sort of good grassroots, bottom-up, positive visions that we're trying to do. So I think calling it out is absolutely essential. and having conversations about where these messages come from, what tables they're around, and how they're influencing government policy. In whose interest is it to make sure people think heat pumps don't work in lots of houses? There's a lot of communication about that, and I think that needs to be much more part of the conversation that we have around this, that it is in some people's interest to delay the transition. And it's not the majority of people. People in the UK, 2/3 of people think that climate action needs to be dealt with a degree of urgency. So the delay, kick it down the line thing is not a public view. It is a particular corporations and individuals very embedded within them view.
Absolutely, but that's a case where knowledge is needed, isn't it? To expose that those practices and things that go on need to be exposed.
And also things like, I would say where people have taken steps to expose the kind of culture washing of fossil fuel companies sponsoring cultural institutions or events. Yes, I think you should sit on a panel and talk with somebody from a fossil fuel company about decarbonisation. But should we be enthusiastically taking that money into our cultural sector whilst accepting their net zero commitments as being absolutely great? I would say no. We need to be much more critical there.
Yep.
Well, that's really important point. So perhaps if we could go to you, Jason, what do you think about that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think we seem to skip politics in all of it, and leadership. We talk about having a vision and a positive future, but we don't have that. We're completely rudderless and at sea at the moment. And so definitely I've tried to, as much as I can, to sort of call out fossil fuel organisations and lobbyists, but it's very difficult.
Brian, how do you deal with this situation, especially given your profile?
Well, I think one of the problems is that we've had quite an uneven battle, because our side, if you like, has been thinking that information was the answer. It isn't the answer. We've all had a lot of information for a long time, and putting out more information, which is what we keep doing, isn't changing people's minds. So they've actually chosen the right tools to work with. They're working with emotions. They're working with people's feelings about what makes them feel good or valuable or right or whatever. Well, we should be doing a little bit more of that. Now, you might think that's deceptive or underhand, and that we should just be telling the truth, the bald truth, pages of statistics. It's not working, and I am not minded to carry on with it just because it seems to be sort of the thing that liberals ought to do, to tell the truth. I just want to get a result. And this is why I've become more and more interested in the idea of trying to persuade the religions of the world that this is their mission. Saving the planet is their mission. That's their God. That's what they've got to work towards. So I have been speaking to religious people quite a lot in the last few years, and I've become more and more convinced that even though I don't agree with them about the central tenet of their belief, they have a commitment to the future which is kind of unfettered, actually. They're not in it for the money. They're in it because they believe in human life, in people being together and doing things cooperatively. So I want to go with them. I want to fight those lobbyists in those terms.
That's an interesting position, one which I'm sure we could talk for quite some time about.
Is the font any better for you here now? They've changed the font.
Oh, thank you. I'll do this one. Let me just do this one. Have we lost part of one? Is it scrolled down or up to...
It's just a question. The climate movement?
Okay, so we had... there was a question about specific examples. Can I ask you, a couple of you this time, just to give a specific example of where culture has made an impact in this space, in this world of trying to engage people and get them to be involved?
Well,
specific examples?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Recycling, upcycling. It's what all kids are doing now.
So
it's chicer to wear clothes you've got in a charity shop, or in chazzers, as they call them now. You get stuff out of a chazzer and you put together a weird outfit from That's much cooler than.
Yeah, I think fashion has had to look at itself very, very
Yeah.
deeply, perhaps more so than a lot of other industries. So thank you for that. I was thinking of the group known as Led by Donkeys, because I think they're brilliant.
Geniuses.
And the way they kind of mix facts and but also have a very strong emotional pull. And if you haven't seen their work, do check them out, Led by Donkeys. They most frequently do projections on the side of buildings and let you know what's going on inside that nobody else will tell you. So I think they're quite effective. Anybody else got any other quick examples?
I was thinking of the Ellison exhibit outside the Tate with the ice that slowly melted. I thought that was quite an interesting way of
A striking image, isn't it?
giving something a sort of tactile feel to it. It's so abstract, climate change, that it needs something to be able to relate to.
Thank you. I'm going to go on. I think we've got time for a couple more. So I'm going to go to the one, does the current spate of vandalising art, do you think it is raising the issue of climate change with the public in a, maybe there's an implication there in a positive way? I don't know. But what do you think is the impact of the vandalisation of art?
Well, that, I think, is a very specific issue, which, personally speaking, I think is reflective of the angst and how much we are enraged by this issue, where people don't feel that they're being listened to and feel that they need to carry out these acts to draw attention. For me, it's a symptom of not addressing the issue and needing to be heard. And I think that we can stand on various sides of the debate on whether we think that that's ethical or not, but the point is, fundamentally, we are where we are. So what do these people do? They are expressing their exasperation, and they're not necessarily wrong. They might not be right in the way that they carry things out, but they're not wrong either. So I think that it's a real quandary, I think.
Carly, what's your view?
I think it's very hard to tell what the impact of that is for two reasons. One, we're all a bit too in it to know. So any sense of what it's doing to the public, if such a thing existed, is challenging. But also because sort of time will have to pass for us to see in a kind of research way, who was successful here. But I think the point that the protesters often make is that now we talk in such glowing terms about the suffragettes, for example.
Yeah.
Some of whom did window breaking campaigns and broke the law, and now everybody talks as if, well, if I'd been there, I'd have been a suffragette. But actually, would we really be? Because not only are we perhaps not joining those protests, but we're talking often in quite critical terms. So I think the thing I said before about it creating, they're stretching the space that we talk about, and I think that is, for me, that is positive, because it is creating a lot of people saying, yeah, but we all agree about these things that we should be doing and we are doing, we need to accelerate. I don't agree that was the right way to do it, but I do agree we should do all these things. And I think, I think they've thought about that a lot, about what they're trying to do by taking that stance.
Yeah, I agree, without condoning.
I agree and condone. I think it's heroic.
I should have said encouraging. Okay.
Remember, there's no pictures actually getting hurt.
Yeah, I know.
It's entirely symbolic. It's very clever.
Absolutely. And I also think that it calls into question some of those institutions that take money from fossil fuel companies, and also this thing about the value of high art, And so we can get really anxious about, some soup that doesn't actually touch a painting, where people are literally drowning in Pakistan or whatever.
Yeah.
And, and this is not the most important thing that's happening. So absolutely, I agree. Okay, so most artists rarely make pronouncements about climate change.
They rarely make pronouncements about anything.
You make lifestyle changes like flying less in order to serve as societal role models. How can we persuade them of the exigency? Well, some of us may wish to contest the premise of that question, But Carly, you...
Yeah, so we've done some work with the BAM Massive Attack around decarbonising their tour and also making a roadmap for decarbonising the sector. And I think, you know, they've been around long enough and have got sort of broad enough shoulders to take the critique that potentially comes with standing up and making those kinds of statements. But I think what they have done is very clever in the sense that they are adopting, you know, they're trying to push innovation, they're adopting it themselves. It's from an authentic leadership point of view that they are able to then say these things need to change, and we are trying to help make them change by building all kinds of partnerships and collaborations and things. And I think what's hard for many artists, particularly who are maybe, you know, more on the way up in terms of the level of exposure and influence they have, is that I think many of them are worried that they will be heavily critiqued by people who are both super behind doing things about climate change and actually really keen to delay any action on climate change. Those two sources coalesce to critique, you know, famous or rich people that try to do these things. So I think if we can come together more to help get these pathways in place that mean that actually tours are much more decarbonised, we do have different kinds of travel, we do have different kinds of energy supply, then it gives artists a sort of safer space, if you like, and there's a security in numbers of them coming forward to do that. And I mean, I would also challenge it that I think lots of artists have, you know, through things like Music Declares Emergency, through the number of people that are part of Earth%. But it would be great if there were more, but they need to feel confident that the industry behind them is delivering a transformation in how they do things, because otherwise they're sort of waving the banner while still doing, you know, very highly carbon intensive things like taking private jets.
Absolutely.
Can I just add something
yeah, sure.
to that? One of the things that we have to accept is that we're all going to be hypocrites.
Yeah.
It is not possible to live in this society,
Absolutely.
whatever your views, without being hypocritical. The only way you could not be hypocritical is just to stay in bed and not get up, actually. Just to die, actually. That would be the least hypocritical. But I see so much and so many times when activists are interviewed on TV, the interviewer says, "But you drive a car."
Yeah.
As if suddenly that invalidates your options for saying anything about anything. And I think, as Gavin Turk said at my studio the other day, he said, hug your hypocrisy. You're going to be a hypocrite because we, as George Monbiot said, we're enmeshed in the system that we're trying to change. You can't help but have to make choices between one bad option and a slightly better one. But the thing I keep saying to people is this mysteriously interesting old phrase, the best is the enemy of the good. You know, if you stop doing anything, you're not going to do anything because it isn't the perfect thing to do. You won't do anything. So we just have to accept that we're going to be compromised and we're going to be hypocrites, but we can still do something. And we've got to stop kind of pretending we're not hypocrites. What I saw so many of the interviewees doing in these kinds of, where some smart schmuck on television shouts at them, "But you drove here." As if that says, therefore, your whole argument is invalidated. We've just got to come back and say, look, we're all hypocrites. We can't help it. We're in a situation where nobody can be pure. So let's just accept it and get on and do something.
Yeah, I think maybe because if you accuse somebody of being hypocritical, it sounds like a really negative thing.
Yeah.
But I totally agree with the essence of what you're saying, because nobody can be perfect, so therefore, you know, what are we there to do? But there are always going to be these tensions, and that kind of thing is come up a lot around the World Cup. It's what I call whataboutism. It's like, so you can't be critical of Qatar because of Europe's colonial history, according to Mr. Infantino. So, you know, but it's not really an argument at all. So we shouldn't be sucked in by that, because to me that's another way of trying to get out of what the urgency is and what we should all be trying to do, and who's got the most responsibility to bear in all of this situation.
Can I say really quickly, I think one of the things is we've shifted to this idea of net zero, as if we've been talking about that for ages. It's actually super recent. And it's made everybody, particularly corporations, I think, get to this idea that you could do things without any impact. And actually, much like owning the hypocrisy, I think you have to own the impact. You know, the nature of the system that we operate within means that you can't be net zero on Tuesday. You're going to have to put the work in. I mean, you can if you buy enough offsets, but that kind of tells you all you need to know about that strategy. So I think that has led to this sort of sense of we all need to have like no impact, like right now. And actually, it's a much more of a process of rapidly reducing our impact. But owning that the things that we do, it's very difficult to spend £1 without it having a carbon impact. And that really locks us into that.
Okay, I think we've probably not got time for any more questions. But I'm going to finish now by asking the panelists, each panelist, to respond to this point about, from your perspective, is there sort of one new thing or one new thought that you've taken away from this discussion, the questions that we've had, and just the whole kind of setup here? Is there something that you've thought that you haven't thought before this evening? Do I need to give you time to let the wheels turn around?
I could do a quick one while you guys are...
Do a quick one.
I really like your idea about alliances of working with religious groups, and I think that, you know, much like we talked before about the kind of incumbent interest, people against this agenda are very good at getting a broad coalition. We don't need to agree about everything. We can agree enough to stop those guys. Whereas I think the climate change movement, if you like, has often suffered from really loving arguing amongst ourselves. And if we could build more broad alliances, I think that would be a good thing.
Nilesh?
I think for me, it's really confirmed that brilliant communication will change the world. And I think just the variety of perspectives that we've shared tonight shows that we need brilliant stories to try and align behind a single narrative so we can all get behind it and take action.
Jason, a new thought for you?
Well, I've just been pondering the bit about religion and how culture is, you know, a new religion. I think, you know, that's a you know, really good way of thinking about it, and something that's worked, well, not worked, but something that we've used to organise societies for a very long time, and that's what we need to make such a transition.
And finally to you, Brian.
Well, I want to introduce the other sort of entity that I think should be part of this discussion. So I'd love to get religions involved. I would love to get the military involved as well, because I think, interestingly, the military has quite a long horizon in terms of thinking. And in fact, the military does more research into climate change than almost any other organisation, because it's a security issue. So I would love to, just as I would love to reorientate religions towards taking this on as their central issue, I would like militaries to do that as well, to say, look, the enemy isn't going to be China or Russia. It's going to be millions of immigrants everywhere, people desperate to try to stay alive because their countries have been flooded or burnt down. So I wish that those huge budgets and all the expertise that the military has could just be redirected. It's only a few degrees, and suddenly we would have all the budgets we need to fight the fossil fuel companies. In fact, they would all be on our side. They would have to be. So I think what we need is to understand that we're in a kind of war, but it's a war not against another nation, but a war against this huge event that's approaching us. A friend of mine called Andrew Boyd wrote a book that isn't published yet called I Want a Better Catastrophe. And the premise of the book is that we're headed for catastrophe, and it seems pretty clear when you look at the science that that's true. Our choice is to make it a better catastrophe. So out of the range of possible catastrophes, let's go for a better one. And I think that's really how we should be thinking.
Great. Well, thank you all.
Cheerful.
I was actually going to say, well, my thought was we can be more hopeful and try and instill, but that doesn't run counter to what you're saying,
No.
because we know that as a human being, we encounter crises all the time, right? Some of them are little crises and some of them are bigger. Some of them are really difficult and complex and some of them seem more amenable to addressing. So the idea that, to make a better catastrophe is actually one of those kind of enigmatic and slightly contradictory phrases that I think could actually work to instill hope, because there are things that we can do to mitigate the worst impact of that, not only for us here in the UK, I have to say, but to think about what happens around the world. Okay then, so now a formal thank you to Jason, Nilesh, Carly and Brian. Thank you very much indeed for participating in this conversation, and I hope everybody's enjoyed that.
Thank you, Lola.
Well, I don't really know how to add to that, but we're all looking for a better catastrophe anyway. But so many ideas there, but love triumphs, and we have to love our planet and the life on it. Or maybe just thinking of our own children and grandchildren, perhaps. The need for a positive vision. At the same side, there's always the urgency, and how one gets a positive vision and gets the urgency across as well. And working with emotions, but I think we can work with emotions and facts and communicate that, and that we're really strong if we're doing that. But perhaps I can finish with the two phases of the revolution, and perhaps we really have finished phase one, where we realize we're all realizing individually there's a real problem, and now we're just getting together for the second stage of the revolution. Let's hope so. So this event was recorded, and the recording will be available shortly on our YouTube channel. I want to thank you all very much for coming and taking part here in the 2022 Grantham Annual Lecture. And that QR code you've been looking at, or that Menti thing with the number, you can add your comments there, and we'd really like feedback on the events. They'll be anonymous and will not be shared. I really just want to think by thanking the panelists again, the chair, Baroness Lola Young, and our keynote speaker, Brian Eno. Thank you.